Story number 1. The Wendigo of the Northern Wilds. Winter in the northern forests of North America is a season of stark beauty and unforgiving harshness. The snow blankets everything in a serene, white silence, masking the treacherous paths and hidden dangers that lie beneath. For years, locals have whispered about the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit, an embodiment of insatiable hunger and relentless pursuit, haunting these very woods. I was never one to believe in such tales, dismissing them as mere folklore spun from the isolation and fear that winter brings. That was until the blizzard of 2023 changed everything. I had always been drawn to the solitude of the wilderness. As a wildlife photographer, the northern forests offered endless opportunities to capture nature in its most raw and untouched state. This winter, I decided to embark on a solo expedition deeper into the woods than I had ever dared before, eager to document the untouched beauty that few ventured to witness. Equipped with my camera, warm gear, and a healthy respect for the elements, I set out on what I believed would be another routine assignment. The first few days were idyllic. The forest was a pristine expanse of white, the trees heavy with snow, their branches bowing under the weight. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a distant owl or the rustle of an animal in the underbrush. I found a secluded spot by a frozen lake, setting up camp with a view that promised countless photographic opportunities. Nights were cold but peaceful, the stars glittering brightly against the inky sky. However, as the days turned into weeks, the weather began to shift. The early signs were subtle, short-lived snowstorms that seemed more intense than usual. Winds howling through the trees with a ferocity that sent shivers down my spine. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the unpredictability of winter weather. But then, the local stories began to echo in my mind, reminding me of the legends I had dismissed so easily. One evening, as I sat by my campfire reviewing the day's shots, a particularly violent storm rolled in. The sky darkened rapidly, the temperature plummeting as the wind whipped the snow into a frenzied dance. Visibility dropped to near zero, and the once peaceful forest transformed into a nightmarish labyrinth of swirling white. I decided to pack up early, knowing that traveling through such conditions would be perilous. As I trudged through the snow, the storm seemed to close in around me, each step harder than the last. Hours passed, and the storm showed no signs of abating. My compass spun erratically, rendering it useless, and my map had been swallowed by the blinding whiteness. Panic began to set in as I realized I was hopelessly lost. I attempted to retrace my steps, but the forest had changed. Paths once familiar now obscured by fresh snow. Exhaustion weighed heavily on me, and the cold gnawed at my resolve. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that resonated through the trees, sending a chill deeper than the winter air itself. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to locate the source of the sound. It seemed to move with me, echoing my every step, growing louder and more menacing. The stories of the Wendigo flashed through my mind, the thought too terrifying to acknowledge yet impossible to dismiss. Quickened my pace, desperation driving me forward. But the creature's presence only intensified. The growls turned into haunting cries, voices filled with anguish and rage. Weaving through the howling wind, my flashlight flickered, casting long, wavering shadows that danced at the edge of my vision. In the distance, I caught a glimpse of something towering through the snow, a hulking figure with eyes that burned like embers, red and unblinking, piercing the darkness. Fear surged through me as I stumbled, nearly falling in the deep snow. The Wendigo loomed closer, its form shifting and contorting with each step, embodying the very essence of my nightmares. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy, as if the weight of the forest itself was holding me back. The creature's presence was suffocating, an oppressive force that seemed to drain the warmth from my body. In a last-ditch effort to survive, I turned towards a denser part of the forest, hoping to lose the creature in the maze of trees. The Wendigo pursued relentlessly, his cries echoing around me, a constant reminder of the thin line between myth and reality. My breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale a battle against the freezing air that threatened to consume me. As exhaustion took its toll, I collapsed onto the snow, shivering uncontrollably. The creature stopped, this massive frame towering above me, eyes still glowing with an unnatural light. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the storm's fury momentarily subsiding as if holding its breath. The Wendigo tilted its head, studying me with a hunger that went beyond mere survival. It sought something darker, something primal. In that moment of eerie stillness, I felt a strange calm wash over me. The fear that had paralyzed me began to ebb, replaced by a resolute determination. I realized that the Wendigo was not just a spirit of hunger but a tormented soul, bound to the forest by a curse that twisted its very essence. Understanding this connection gave me a flicker of hope, a way to perhaps break the cycle of torment. Summoning every ounce of strength, I spoke into the freezing air, my voice barely audible over the wind. "I don't want to fight you. I want to help you find peace." The creature hesitated, its red eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that seemed to pierce my very soul. Slowly, it began to retreat, the storm around us resuming its rage as if the confrontation had reignited its fury. But as the Wendigo faded into the swirling snow, a path began to emerge, faint but discernible, leading me towards a direction I hadn't noticed before. With renewed hope, I followed the trail, the storm gradually subsiding as dawn approached. The first light of day broke through the clouds, melting the snow and revealing the forest in a new, less menacing light. Exhausted but alive, I finally found my way back to my campsite, the remnants of my expedition scattered but intact. As I packed up my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Wendigo was watching, a silent guardian ensuring that its story would not be forgotten. Upon my return to civilization, I recounted my harrowing experience to anyone who would listen. Skeptics dismissed it as a product of isolation-induced paranoia, but I knew what I had seen, determined to honor the spirit I had encountered. I dedicated myself to learning more about the Wendigo, uncovering stories of those who had crossed paths with the creature in the unforgiving winter. Over time, my account became part of the local lore, a testament to the enduring power of folklore and the thin veil between the natural and supernatural. I continued to visit the northern forests, not as a solitary wanderer but as a guardian of the stories that whispered through the snow. Each winter, as the storms raged and the forests fell silent, I felt a deeper connection to the land and the spirits that roamed it. The Wendigo of the northern wilds remains a symbol of the untamed wilderness and the primal fears that lie within us all. My encounter taught me that legends are not merely tales to be dismissed but echoes of truths long buried beneath the snow. As the years pass, I hold on to the memory of that blizzard, a reminder that even in the darkest, coldest nights, understanding and empathy can bridge the gap between man and myth, offering a path to peace amidst the haunting echoes of the past. Story number 2. The Haunting of Duluth Manor. Winter in Duluth, Minnesota, was unforgiving. The bitter cold wrapped around the city like a relentless shroud, and the heavy snowfalls seemed endless, blanketing everything in a suffocating silence. It was during one such winter, in the year 1920, that the Hargrave family moved into the old Victorian house on Elm Street, unaware of the dark history that awaited them. I still remember the day we arrived at Duluth Manor. My parents, eager to start anew after a series of unfortunate events back east, had purchased the house for a fraction of its true value. The real estate agent had assured us it was a grand residence, perfect for our growing family. Little did we know, the manor held secrets that would unravel our lives in the most horrifying ways. The house stood imposingly against the snow-covered landscape, its once vibrant paint now faded and peeling. Tall windows reflected the gray sky, and the wrought iron gates creaked ominously in the cold wind. Despite its eerie appearance, my parents were determined to make it our home. They spent days cleaning and renovating, bringing life back into the decaying structure. From the moment we settled in, strange occurrences began to plague our household. It started subtly, doors creaking open on their own, footsteps echoing through the empty halls, and cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. My younger siblings and I tried to rationalize these events, attributing them to the house's old age and our imaginations running wild in the isolated winter. But things escalated quickly. One night, as the wind howled outside and snow piled high against the windows, we heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the roof. My parents dismissed it as the wind, but deep down, I felt a growing unease. The footsteps continued nightly, growing louder and more deliberate, as if someone was pacing above us, trapped within the manor's walls. Then, the disappearances began. It started with our youngest sister, Lily. One evening, after dinner, she was nowhere to be found. We searched the house frantically, calling her name into the silent rooms. But there was no trace of her. The police were called, but with no evidence or witnesses. They chalked it up to a possible runaway, considering the harsh winter conditions. My parents, though devastated, held on to hope that Lily would return. Days turned into weeks, and more members of our family began to vanish without a trace. My older brother, Thomas, disappeared one night after returning from a late shift at work. Our parents were beside themselves with worry, but the authorities found nothing, no signs of struggle, no footprints in the snow, nothing to indicate where they might have gone. As the disappearances continued, the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly oppressive. The once grand halls now felt like a maze of shadows and whispers. We started hearing voices in the dead of night, soft murmurs that seemed to come from the very walls. Objects moved on their own, and the temperature inside the house plummeted to freezing levels, even when the weather outside was relatively mild. One particularly cold night, I decided to confront whatever was haunting our home. Armed with only a flashlight and a determination born from desperation, I ventured into the attic, the heart of the manor's mysteries. The attic was vast, filled with old furniture, dusty trunks, and forgotten memories. As I ascended the creaky stairs, the air grew colder, and the whispers became louder, echoing through the confined space. In the center of the attic stood an old rocking chair, swaying gently despite the lack of any visible force. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced around the room. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my flashlight, but the beam was dim, barely piercing the gloom. That's when I saw them, ghostly apparitions of my family members, their faces twisted in fear and sorrow. Lily, Thomas, and my parents stood before me, their eyes hollow and pleading. "Help us," they whispered in unison, their voices echoing through the attic. I reached out, desperate to touch them, but my hand passed through their ethereal forms. A cold, malevolent presence filled the room, and I felt an invisible force pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. The spirits began to move towards me, their movements slow and deliberate. "We are trapped," they moaned. Bound by the curse of Duluth Manor, I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The room seemed to warp and shift, the boundaries between the living and the dead blurring before my eyes. Images of the past flooded my mind, visions of previous inhabitants suffering untold horrors, their lives cut short by an unseen evil that lurked within the manor's walls. Desperate to escape, I fled the attic, descending the stairs as fast as I could. The house seemed to come alive around me, doors slamming shut, windows shattering, and the sound of footsteps chasing me through the labyrinthine corridors. I burst into the living room, gasping for air, only to find the room transformed, now a scene of chaos and despair, with ghostly figures moving in a frenzied dance of torment. In that moment, I realized that the manor was not just haunted, it was alive, feeding off our fear and desperation. The curse that bound our family was ancient, rooted in the manor's dark history of cruelty and suffering. determined to break free. I remembered the old legends I had heard about Duluth Manor, a place built on tragedy, where the spirits of the wronged sought vengeance on the living. Gathering every ounce of courage, I confronted the malevolent force that held us captive. "I won't let you take us," I declared, my voice steady despite the terror coursing through me. "We deserve peace." The room grew colder still, and the spirits of my family pressed closer, their sorrowful gazes meeting mine. "Peace is what you will give us," they whispered, their voices intertwining with the howling wind outside. "Release us from this eternal winter." I understood then that the only way to free my family was to uncover the truth behind the manor's curse. Delving into the town's history, I discovered that Duluth Manor had been built on the grounds of an old burial site. Disturbed during its construction, the spirits of those wronged in life had been bound to the house, their souls unable to find rest. Armed with this knowledge, I performed a ritual of appeasement, honoring the spirits and seeking their forgiveness for the transgressions of the past. The air in the house shifted, the oppressive darkness lifting as a sense of calm washed over us. The spirits of my family smiled softly, their forms fading into the light as they found the peace they had long been denied. As dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the manor's windows, melting the snow and dispelling the shadows that had held us captive. The house, once a place of torment, now stood serene and quiet, this dark history finally laid to rest. We left Duluth Manor that day, the weight of the curse lifted from our souls. The winter had been harsh, but it had also forged a bond of resilience and hope within our family. The manor remained, its windows reflecting the peaceful landscape, a silent testament to the power of love and determination in overcoming the darkest of evils. To this day, when the snow falls heavy on Duluth streets, I remember the winter of 1920 and the horrors we endured. The story of Duluth Manor serves as a reminder that even in the coldest, darkest times, there is always a path to redemption and peace. Story number 3. Titanic's winter return, New York. Winter in New York City has a way of amplifying the city's mysteries. The snow-covered streets glisten under the streetlights, casting long shadows that seem to whisper secrets of the past. As someone deeply fascinated by history and the supernatural, I've always been drawn to the stories that linger in the cold months, especially those connected to tragedies long gone. One such tale that has haunted my thoughts for years is the legend of the Titanic's winter return, a chilling phenomenon that locals believe brings the spirits of the ill-fated passengers back to the city every winter. It was December 2024, a particularly harsh winter that seemed to amplify every eerie tale I had heard growing up. Determined to uncover the truth behind the whispers, I decided to spend the winter investigating the reports of Titanic ghosts appearing in New York's historic hotels and museums that housed artifacts from the doomed ship. Armed with my camera, voice recorder, and a notebook, I set out to experience firsthand the supernatural events that many dismissed as mere folklore. My first stop was the iconic Waldorf Astoria, a hotel renowned for its opulent architecture and rich history. During my research, I discovered that the hotel housed several artifacts salvaged from the Titanic, including a grand chandelier that had once adorned the ship's first-class dining room. As I entered the lobby, the warmth enveloped me, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The chandelier hung majestically above, its crystals sparkling like frozen tears. I checked into one of the hotel's historic suites, a room preserved to reflect the elegance of the early 20th century. After settling in, I decided to explore the hotel after dark, when the veil between the living and the dead is believed to be thinnest. The snow fell heavily, muffling the sounds of the city and creating an almost surreal silence. As midnight approached, I made my way to the lounge where the Titanic artifacts were displayed. The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the flickering fireplace and the soft glow of antique lamps. I set up my camera and recorder, the air thick with anticipation. Hours passed with nothing out of the ordinary, until a sudden chill swept through the room. causing me to shiver involuntarily. The temperature plummeted, and my breath became visible in the frigid air. A soft, melancholic melody began to play, emanating from the grand chandelier above. It was the haunting tune of Nearer, My God, to Thee, the song famously associated with the Titanic's final moments. The music grew louder, yet there was no visible source. My heart raced as I scanned the room, searching for the origin of the sound. Then, through the thick haze of snowflakes outside the window, I saw them, shadowy figures dressed in early 20th century attire, their faces pale and sorrowful. They moved gracefully, almost ethereally, as if reenacting their last moments aboard the Titanic. One figure, a woman in a flowing gown, glanced directly at me, her eyes filled with an indescribable sadness. I felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow and loss, as if their pain was seeping into my very soul. I attempted to speak, but my voice was caught in my throat. The apparitions continued their silent procession, the weight of their tragic history pressing down on me. The temperature continued to drop, and the room seemed to close in around me. Suddenly, the music ceased, and the figures began to fade, dissolving into the cold night air. The room returned to its previous stillness, leaving me shaken and breathless, determined to document my experience. I reviewed the footage and recordings the next day. To my astonishment, the recorder captured faint whispers and the haunting melody, though no one else was present in the lounge. The photographs showed blurry apparitions moving gracefully through the room, their forms barely distinguishable from the shadows. Encouraged by this evidence, I visited the Maritime Museum of New York, another repository of Titanic artifacts. The museum, with its expansive exhibits and preserved relics, seemed the perfect place to continue my investigation. As I wandered through the halls, I felt a persistent chill, the air heavy with unspoken stories. I settled near the Titanic exhibit, where a replica of the ship's grand staircase stood as a centerpiece. As night fell, I returned to the museum, eager to witness another potential encounter. The museum was eerily quiet, the only sounds being the distant hum of the city and the soft footsteps of security guards on their rounds. I set up my equipment near the staircase, the room dimly lit by the ambient lighting. Hours passed with no signs of activity, until the clock struck midnight. A sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the lights and plunging the space into darkness. My flashlight flickered to life, casting long, wavering beams across the exhibit. The temperature dropped sharply, my breath visible in the icy air. Then, the haunting melody returned, echoing through the vast halls of the museum. From the shadows, ghostly figures began to emerge, their presence filling the room with an otherworldly energy. They moved towards the staircase, their movements slow and deliberate, as if reliving their final moments on the Titanic. One of the figures, a young man in a captain's uniform, stood at the base of the stairs, gazing upwards with a look of profound despair. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The apparition seemed to sense my presence, turning to face me with hollow eyes that pierced through the darkness. I felt an overwhelming sense of empathy, understanding the depth of their sorrow and longing. The figure raised a hand, as if reaching out for help, before fading into the shadows once more. The music ceased, and the room returned to its silent stillness. I was left alone with the lingering sense of loss and the weight of the stories that had unfolded before me. As I packed my equipment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been touched by something beyond explanation, a connection to the souls who had perished in one of history's greatest tragedies. In the days that followed, I delved deeper into the history of the Titanic and its survivors. I interviewed historians, museum curators, and even some locals who claimed to have witnessed the apparitions during the winter months. Each account added layers to the haunting narrative, painting a picture of restless spirits seeking remembrance and closure. One particularly cold evening, I decided to visit a small hotel near the docks that also housed Titanic artifacts. The hotel, with its vintage decor and maritime memorabilia, was another hotspot for supernatural sightings. As I entered my room, I felt the familiar chill of the winter air seeping through the walls. Determined to document every detail, I set up my equipment and waited. Hours passed with nothing unusual, until the clock struck 3. The room was plunged into darkness as the heating system failed, leaving me in the icy grip of the night. The haunting melody returned, softer this time, playing from the grand piano in the corner of the room. I approached the instrument, the keys moving on their own, producing the sorrowful tune. Suddenly, a figure appeared beside the piano, a woman in an elegant dress, her face tear-streaked and eyes hollow with grief. She began to play, her movements graceful yet tormented, as if reliving the agony of the Titanic's sinking. I reached out, my hand passing through her ethereal form, feeling the coldness of her sorrow. "Remember us," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. "Remember our stories." The room seemed to spin, the weight of their plea pressing down on me. I nodded silently, understanding that their presence was a call to honor their memories and ensure that their stories were never forgotten. As the last notes of the piano faded, the figure dissolved into the cold night air, leaving me with a profound sense of purpose. Reflecting on my experiences, I realized that the Titanic's winter return was more than just a ghost story. It was a testament to the enduring human spirit and the need for remembrance. The apparitions I encountered were not mere specters of the past, but souls yearning to be acknowledged and remembered. Their presence during the winter months served as a reminder of the tragedy's lasting impact and the importance of preserving their stories for future generations. Inspired by my encounters, I compiled my findings into a comprehensive documentary, detailing the supernatural events surrounding the Titanic's artifacts in New York City. The film resonated deeply with audiences, sparking renewed interest in the Titanic's legacy and the stories of those who survived and those who did not. It also served as a reminder of the thin veil that separates our world from the realms of the departed, especially during the cold, silent nights of winter. As each winter arrived, I couldn't help but feel a lingering connection to the spirits of the Titanic. The snow-covered streets of New York seemed to carry their whispers, and the artifacts I documented became conduits for their stories. The winter return of the Titanic's souls became a symbol of remembrance and the enduring bond between the living and the dead. In the end, my journey into the heart of New York's haunted winter tales taught me that some stories are too powerful to fade into oblivion. The spirits of the Titanic continue to seek recognition and peace, their presence a haunting reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring impact of tragedy. And as the snow falls each winter, I am reminded of their silent plea to remember, to honor, and to never forget the lives lost on that fateful voyage. Story number 4. Whispers of the Penitentiary. Winter in Pennsylvania was unforgiving, and nowhere was this more evident than at the Eastern State Penitentiary. The once majestic structure, with its towering Gothic architecture, stood ominously against the bleak, snow-covered landscape. As someone who had always been fascinated by the macabre and the unexplained, I found myself irresistibly drawn to the penitentiary's dark reputation. Known for its harsh conditions and brutal treatment of inmates, Eastern State had long been a hotspot for ghost stories and supernatural occurrences, especially during the long, cold winters when the nights seemed endless and the shadows deeper. My journey to uncover the truth behind these tales began on a particularly frigid December evening. Armed with a flashlight, a voice recorder, and an insatiable curiosity, I ventured into the penitentiary grounds, determined to experience firsthand the phenomena that locals whispered about in hushed tones. The snow crunched under my boots as I approached the iron gates, their bars cold and unwelcoming. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the distant sound of howling wind, setting an eerie backdrop for what was to come. As I stepped inside, the enormity of the penitentiary became apparent. The imposing facade loomed above me, its windows dark and foreboding. The once bustling corridors were now silent, save for the occasional drip of melting ice from the eaves. I made my way to the main entrance, pushing the heavy doors open with a creak that echoed through the empty halls. The interior was a labyrinth of stone corridors and shadowed cells, each one holding its own secrets and stories of suffering. My first stop was the solitary confinement wing, a place notorious for its inhumane conditions. The walls were bare, save for the occasional graffiti left by inmates long gone. As I navigated the narrow passageways, my flashlight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The temperature dropped noticeably, my breath visible in the cold air. I could almost feel the weight of despair that must have pressed down on the prisoners who once called this place home. Reaching the end of the corridor, I paused outside a cell that stood slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind me. The cell was empty, but the atmosphere was heavy with an unspoken presence. I set up my voice recorder, hoping to capture any unusual sounds. As I sat there, the silence was broken by a faint, distant cry. It was a sound filled with anguish, echoing through the empty halls. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, but the noise quickly faded, leaving me in an oppressive stillness. Determined to press on, I continued my exploration, moving deeper into the penitentiary. The corridors twisted and turned, leading me to various sections of the facility. Each area seemed to hold its own spectral inhabitants. In the dining hall, I could hear the clinking of silverware and muffled conversations, despite there being no one around. In the exercise yard, the sounds of footsteps and laughter echoed eerily, as if the spirits of former inmates were reliving their last moments of freedom. As night fell, the true nature of the penitentiary revealed itself. The shadows grew longer, and the cold became more intense, seeping into my bones. I found myself in the old chapel, a place once used for worship and reflection by the inmates. The stained glass windows were shattered, and the pews were covered in dust and debris. I lit a candle, its flickering flame providing a small measure of comfort against the encroaching darkness. Sitting in the pew, I began to record my thoughts, detailing the strange occurrences I had witnessed throughout the evening. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the chapel, followed by the unmistakable sound of chains rattling. My flashlight flickered wildly, casting chaotic shadows on the walls. Panic surged through me as I heard footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was walking towards me. I turned to face the sound, and there, at the end of the aisle, stood a figure clad in old-fashioned prison garb. His face was gaunt, eyes hollow and devoid of life. The apparition stared directly at me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow emanating from its presence. Before I could react, the figure began to move towards me, the steps heavy and labored. The temperature dropped further, and I could see my breath forming icy patterns in the air. "Help us!" a whisper echoed in my mind. Though no sound came from the figure's mouth, the message was clear, filled with desperation and pain. I reached out instinctively, but my hand met nothing but cold air. The apparition continued its approach, its form becoming more transparent as it neared. Shadows seemed to cling to it, swirling around like dark mist. Suddenly, the scene shifted. I found myself reliving the past, witnessing the horrors that had transpired within these walls. I saw prisoners being led to their cells, the harsh commands of the guards, and the brutal punishments inflicted upon those who dared to resist. The air was thick with fear and anguish, the screams of the tortured echoing endlessly. It was a vivid, horrifying glimpse into the dark history of Eastern State Penitentiary. Snapped back to reality, I was left trembling in the chapel. The apparition had vanished, leaving only the lingering cold and the oppressive silence. I realized that the spirits of the penitentiary were trapped in a cycle of their suffering, unable to move on from the pain and injustice they had endured. My mission became clear. I had to give voice to their stories, to shed light on the darkness that still lingered within these walls. As I made my way back through the penitentiary, The night seemed to grow even more alive with supernatural activity. Doors slammed shut on their own. Ghostly apparitions appeared and disappeared in the blink of an eye, and the sound of distant cries followed me wherever I went. Every step I took felt like a journey deeper into the heart of the penitentiary's haunted legacy. Reaching the main entrance, I felt a surge of relief as I stepped out into the cold night air. The snow was falling heavily now, each flake adding to the already thick blanket that covered the grounds. I looked back at the penitentiary, its windows like dark, watchful eyes staring back at me. The experience had left an indelible mark on my soul, a reminder of the thin veil that separates the living from the dead. In the days that followed, I dedicated myself to documenting everything I had witnessed. My article, Whispers of the Penitentiary, detailed the harrowing experiences and the restless spirits that still haunted Eastern State. It resonated deeply with readers, sparking conversations about the importance of remembering and honoring the past. No matter how dark it may be, the more I delved into the penitentiary's history, the more I uncovered the layers of pain and suffering that had been inflicted within its walls. Each story was a testament to the human spirit's resilience, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. But it was also a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked power and the lingering effects of injustice. One winter night, years after my initial visit, I found myself drawn back to Eastern State Penitentiary. The snow had returned, covering the landscape in a familiar, silent blanket. Armed with a new sense of purpose, I returned to the chapel, hoping to offer some form of closure to the restless spirits I had encountered. As I entered the chapel, the same cold welcomed me, but there was a sense of peace in the air. The apparitions were fewer, their presence less oppressive. I lit another candle, placing it carefully among the pews, a small gesture of respect and remembrance. The temperature seemed to warm slightly, and the shadows softened, as if the spirits were acknowledging my efforts to honor their memories. Sitting in the pew, I felt a presence beside me, not menacing but comforting. The chapel, once a place of torment, now held a sense of tranquility. I realized that by telling their stories, I had helped to release some of the pain that had bound them to this place. The penitentiary, though still haunted, seemed to breathe a little easier, the weight of its dark history slightly lifted. As I left Eastern State Penitentiary that night, the snow continued to fall, each flake a symbol of the enduring connection between the past and the present. The whispers of the penitentiary had been heard, their stories given life through my words. And while the shadows of the past would always linger, there was now a sense of hope that perhaps, one day, the spirits would find the peace they so desperately sought. Winter in Pennsylvania remained harsh, but Pine Brook had changed. The fear that once gripped the town was replaced with a deeper understanding and empathy for those who had suffered within the penitentiary's walls. And as the years went by, the legend of Eastern State Penitentiary evolved from one of terror to one of remembrance and healing, a testament to the power of stories and the enduring human spirit. Story number 5. The Snowman of Vermont. Winter in Vermont was unforgiving. The snow blanketed the small town of Pine Brook, transforming it into a picturesque yet isolating landscape. For decades, the townsfolk whispered about the creature that roamed the surrounding forests, a towering, humanoid figure covered in thick, white fur. They called it the Snowman, a name both eerie and fitting for the creature that had become the stuff of local legend. I had always been skeptical of such tales. As a journalist for the local newspaper, I prided myself on uncovering the truth behind every story. When I first heard about the disappearances and strange footprints, I dismissed them as overblown rumors fueled by the long, dark winters. But as the winter of 2024 deepened, curiosity gnawed at me, urging me to investigate the legend firsthand. It was late December when I decided to take a night hike into the heart of the forest. The moon was a thin crescent, barely illuminating the path ahead. Equipped with my flashlight, camera, and a sturdy pair of boots, I ventured into the woods. determined to separate fact from fiction. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound being the crunch of snow under my feet. The trees stood tall and foreboding, their branches heavy with snow, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. I pressed on, the chill in the air biting through my jacket, making each breath visible. Hours into my hike, I stumbled upon a clearing. My flashlight beam danced across the snow, revealing large, deep footprints that led deeper into the woods. These were no ordinary animal tracks. Each print was over 2 feet long, with distinct toe marks that suggested a humanoid shape. My heart raced as I followed the trail, the possibility of encountering something extraordinary becoming harder to ignore. As I ventured further, the temperature seemed to drop even more, my breath now forming thick clouds in front of me. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the trees, sending shivers down my spine. I froze, trying to locate the source of the sound, but saw nothing beyond the reach of my flashlight. I continued, driven by a mix of fear and fascination, until I reached a dense thicket. Pushing through the branches, I found myself in front of an old, abandoned cabin. The structure looked as though it hadn't been inhabited for years, its windows cracked and door hanging loosely on its hinges. I approached cautiously, the footprints leading me directly to the entrance. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, the remnants of a once lived-in space now covered in dust and cobwebs. My flashlight illuminated the room, revealing old furniture and scattered belongings. It was then that I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the corner of the room. My pulse quickened as I turned towards the noise, shining my light in that direction. There, hunched over a broken window, was the snowman. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, his body entirely covered in thick, white fur that seemed to blend seamlessly with the snow outside. His face was partially obscured, but I could make out 2 deep, dark eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. The creature remained still, its presence both terrifying and mesmerizing. I took a step back, my mind racing for an explanation. Was this the embodiment of the town's fears, a product of collective imagination? Or was there something more sinister at play? The snowman tilted its head slightly, as if studying me, before slowly turning and disappearing into the darkness of the cabin. Determined to capture evidence, I raised my camera, but as I did, a sudden noise erupted from behind me. I spun around to see the cabin door slam shut, the sound reverberating through the small space. Panic surged through me as I realized I was trapped. The temperature plummeted further, my breath now icy and shallow. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Desperate, I searched the cabin for another exit, but found none. The scratching sound returned, louder this time, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. The snowman had returned, standing at the far end of the room. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its presence felt almost tangible, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I mean no harm." The creature didn't respond, but its posture softened slightly, as if acknowledging my plea. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, and began to speak. "I know you're real. I know there's more to this legend than just stories. I want to understand." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the snowman took a step forward, its massive frame moving with an unexpected grace. It extended a hand towards me, a gesture both human and unsettling. I hesitated, then reached out, feeling the coldness of its touch. Instantly, a surge of memories flooded my mind, visions of the creature's existence, its loneliness, and the tragic events that led to its isolation. I saw a time long ago when the snowman was once human, a man named Elias who lived alone in the woods. He was a hermit, shunned by the townsfolk for his reclusive nature and strange habits. One harsh winter, a series of tragic accidents and disappearances were blamed on him, leading to his gradual descent into madness. Elias disappeared one night, and the legend of the snowman was born, a spectral guardian of the forest. Misunderstood and feared. As the memories faded, I found myself back in the cabin, the snowman now standing before me with a look of sorrow. It was clear that this creature was not a monster, but a tormented soul yearning for understanding and peace. I felt a deep sense of empathy, realizing that the true horror was not in the creature itself, but in the town's relentless fear and ostracization. "I'll help you," I vowed, my voice steady. "I'll tell your story, so others can understand." The snowman nodded slowly, a gesture that conveyed gratitude and relief. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the temperature began to rise. The cabin door swung open, and the creature began to fade, its form becoming translucent before disappearing entirely. I stood there for a moment, absorbing the gravity of what had just transpired. Exiting the cabin, I followed the footprints back through the forest, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. The snow sparkled under the morning sun, and the eerie silence of the night gave way to the sounds of waking wildlife. As I made my way back to Pinebrook, I felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that I had uncovered a truth that needed to be shared. In the days that followed, I wrote an in-depth article about my experience, detailing the history of Elias and the misunderstood creature known as the snowman. The story resonated with the townsfolk, sparking conversations about fear, isolation, and the importance of understanding those who are different. Slowly, the legend of the snowman transformed from a tale of terror to one of empathy and reconciliation. Winter in Pinebrook continued to be harsh, but the atmosphere in town had changed. The fear that once gripped the community was replaced with a sense of unity and respect for the mysteries that lay within the forest. And occasionally, when the snow fell thick and the nights were long, I would catch a glimpse of a towering figure moving gracefully through the trees, a silent guardian. Finally at peace, reflecting on my journey, I realized that some legends hold deeper truths, waiting to be uncovered by those willing to look beyond fear. The Snowman of Vermont was a reminder that understanding and compassion can bridge the gap between myth and reality, transforming horror into harmony. Story number 6. The Haunting of Flight 401, Florida. December 1972 was a month that would forever be etched in aviation history, not just for the tragic crash of Eastern Airlines Flight 401, but for the inexplicable phenomena that followed. As someone who has always been fascinated by the supernatural and the mysteries that lie beyond our understanding, I found myself irresistibly drawn to the eerie tales surrounding Flight 401. Determined to uncover the truth, I embarked on a journey that would blur the lines between reality and the unknown. It was a cold winter evening in Florida when I first heard about the legend of Flight 401. The story went that after the crash, pieces of the wreckage were salvaged and repurposed for other flights. However, passengers and crew on these subsequent flights reported sightings of apparitions resembling the lost crew members, particularly during the harsh winter months when the veil between the living and the dead seemed thinner. Intrigued, I decided to take a flight that was rumored to have experienced such encounters. The flight was operated by Eastern Airlines, the same carrier as the ill-fated Flight 401. As I boarded the plane, the atmosphere felt unusually tense, but I brushed it off as pre-flight jitters. I took my seat near the window, hoping to capture any unusual activity with my camera. The flight began smoothly, the hum of the engines and the chatter of passengers creating a semblance of normalcy. However, as we ascended into the night sky, the temperature seemed to drop inexplicably. The cabin lights dimmed, casting long shadows across the aisles. I glanced around and noticed that a few passengers were visibly uncomfortable, whispering nervously among themselves. About an hour into the flight, as we began to cross over the Florida peninsula, the plane encountered severe turbulence. The lights flickered, and a sense of unease settled over the cabin. The flight attendants hurried to reassure passengers, but their strained smiles did little to alleviate the growing tension. I tried to focus on my camera, hoping to document any unusual occurrences. Suddenly, The temperature plummeted further, and a dense fog seemed to envelop the cabin. Visibility through the windows became obscured, and an unnatural silence fell over the passengers. It was then that I saw them, shadowy figures standing in the aisle, their forms vague and indistinct. My heart raced as I realized they resembled the crew members from the Flight 401 crash. One of the apparitions, a man in a uniform identical to that of the Flight 401 pilot, turned towards me. His eyes were hollow, devoid of any warmth or recognition. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure began to move towards me, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the silent cabin. Panic set in as more apparitions appeared, their presence growing stronger. The flight attendants seemed unaffected, continuing their duties with an eerie calmness. I watched in horror as the ghostly crew began to interact with the living passengers, touching shoulders, whispering into ears, and causing objects to move inexplicably. Desperate to understand what was happening, I approached one of the attendants, hoping for an explanation. To my shock, her eyes glazed over, and she began to speak in a voice that was not her own. "They are here to remember," she intoned, her words chilling me to the bone. "They cannot move on until their story is told." Realizing that these spirits were trapped between worlds, bound by the tragedy of their untimely deaths, I felt a surge of compassion. Determined to help, I began to document everything, believing that by telling their story, I could help them find peace. I interviewed passengers who had witnessed the apparitions, gathering their accounts to piece together the full picture of what transpired. As the flight continued, the apparitions became more active, their presence intensifying with each passing hour. The pilot ghost led me to the back of the plane, where I discovered remnants of Flight 401's wreckage that had somehow been concealed within our aircraft. It was as if the spirits were trying to communicate, urging me to uncover the truth behind their demise. The revelations were horrifying. The original Flight 401 had crashed due to a combination of mechanical failures and human error, compounded by the harsh winter conditions that made rescue efforts nearly impossible. The spirits were reliving their final moments, unable to move forward until their story was acknowledged and remembered. Determined to honor their memory, I vowed to share their tale with the world. As dawn approached, the apparitions began to fade, their forms dissipating like mist in the morning light. The temperature in the cabin returned to normal, and the fog lifted, revealing a sky painted with the soft hues of sunrise. The flight attendants regained their composure, and the tension that had gripped the cabin lifted as if by magic. Upon landing, I felt a profound sense of closure. The experience had been both terrifying and enlightening, reinforcing my belief in the existence of the supernatural and the enduring power of unresolved tragedies. I knew that the story of Flight 401 needed to be told, not just as a cautionary tale of aviation safety, but as a testament to the souls who still lingered, seeking recognition and peace. Back on solid ground, I began to write, compiling the accounts of fellow passengers and my own harrowing experience. The story of Flight 401 spread quickly, capturing the imagination of many and shedding light on the mysterious events that followed the crash. Pilots and passengers alike became more aware of the lingering spirits that might inhabit the skies, especially during the unforgiving winter months. Over the years, I continued to investigate similar cases, each one adding to the intricate tapestry of aviation's haunted history. The legacy of Flight 401 served as a reminder that even in our most advanced technological era, there are still mysteries that defy explanation. It underscored the importance of remembering those who lost their lives, ensuring that their stories are never forgotten. Reflecting on that fateful flight, I realized that my encounter was more than just a ghost story. It was a profound lesson in empathy and the enduring connections that bind us beyond the realms of life and death. The spirits of Flight 401 taught me that even in tragedy, there is a need for remembrance and understanding, a call to honor the past so that it may finally rest in peace. To this day, when I board a plane, especially during the winter months, I can't help but feel a lingering presence, a silent acknowledgement of the souls who once took to the skies. The haunting of Flight 401 remains a testament to the mysteries that lie beyond our comprehension, a chilling reminder that some stories are too powerful to be forgotten. Story number 7. Haunting at the Stanley Hotel, Colorado. Winter of 2024 was particularly unforgiving. The snow blanketed Colorado's rugged landscape, transforming it into a serene yet eerie wonderland. I had always been fascinated by the supernatural, and the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado, with its infamous reputation and historical ties to Stephen King's The Shining, was calling my name, determined to uncover its secrets firsthand. I booked a room for a week-long stay, hoping to immerse myself in its haunted legacy and perhaps pen my own horror narrative. Driving through the winding mountain roads, the Stanley Hotel loomed ahead, its Gothic architecture stark against the white expanse. The grand facade, with its towering stone columns and intricate details, exuded an old-world charm that was both inviting and intimidating. As I approached the entrance, the massive wooden doors opened automatically, as if greeting me personally. The lobby was a blend of elegance and antiquity, with grand chandeliers casting soft light on the polished marble floors and antique furnishings. After settling into my room on the top floor, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. The room was spacious, with large windows offering a panoramic view of the snow-covered peaks and the darkened woods beyond. I unpacked my belongings, set up my writing station by the window, and decided to explore the hotel before nightfall. The corridors were dimly lit, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of wooden floors and the distant hum of the HVAC system. I wandered through the hallways, noting the portraits of stern-faced individuals hanging on the walls, their eyes seemingly following my every move. The atmosphere was thick with history, each room and corner holding untold stories. As dusk turned to night, the hotel transformed, the shadows deepened, and the temperature dropped noticeably. I returned to my room, eager to begin my writing, but found the room colder than before. Wrapping myself in a blanket, I started jotting down my observations, hoping to capture the essence of the hotel's mystique. Around midnight, a faint melody began to seep through the walls, the haunting notes of a piano. I glanced at the clock. It was precisely 12 minutes past. Curious, I followed the sound, which seemed to emanate from the lounge area. The music was melancholic, each note lingering in the air like a ghostly whisper. Entering the lounge, I was met with an empty room bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. The grand piano stood in the center, its keys moving on their own, producing the sorrowful tune. I approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. As I reached out to touch the keys, the music abruptly stopped, plunging the room into an oppressive silence. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted further, and I saw my breath form icy patterns in the air. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a fleeting glimpse of a shadowy figure standing by the window. My heart raced as the figure slowly turned towards me, revealing hollow eyes that seemed to pierce my very soul. I tried to speak, but no words came out, only a strangled gasp escaping my lips. The apparition began to move towards me, its form wavering like smoke in the wind. I stumbled back, tripping over a rug and falling to the floor. As I scrambled to my feet, the room began to shift and distort. The walls stretched and warped, the ceiling lowering ominously above me. Panic surged through me as I realized I was trapped in a nightmare come to life. Desperate to escape, I dashed out of the lounge. Racing down the hallway, the corridors seemed endless, each turn leading to more darkness and uncertainty. I could hear whispers echoing around me, voices speaking in languages I couldn't comprehend. The sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, followed my every move, never quite in sync with my own. Turning a corner, I found myself in front of an old elevator. The doors creaked open, revealing a dimly lit shaft. Without thinking, I stepped inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. the elevator began to descend, but instead of moving smoothly, it shuddered and jolted violently. The lights flickered, and the air grew thick with an unsettling presence. In the brief moments between floors, I caught glimpses of apparitions pressing against the elevator doors, ghostly figures with sorrowful expressions, their hands reaching out as if seeking help. My pulse pounded in my ears as the elevator finally ground to a halt. The doors opened to reveal the lobby, but it was no longer the elegant space I had known. The chandeliers hung crookedly, and the furniture was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if the room hadn't been touched in decades. I bolted out of the elevator, racing towards the main entrance. The storm outside had intensified, snow swirling violently around the hotel. As I reached the doors, they slammed shut in front of me, the windows' frost forming intricate patterns that obscured my view. I pounded on the glass, shouting for help, but my voice was muffled by the relentless wind. Turning away, I noticed the lobby had transformed into a grand ballroom. Figures in old-fashioned attire danced gracefully, their movements fluid and otherworldly. They didn't seem to notice my presence, their faces pale and expressionless. The room's atmosphere was both beautiful and haunting, a stark contrast to the terror I felt inside. Seeking another way out, I navigated through the maze-like hotel, each room presenting new horrors. In the library, books flew off the shelves, their pages fluttering wildly as if caught in a storm. In the dining hall, phantom diners sat at long tables, their silverware clinking without any food being consumed. Everywhere I turned, the spirits of the past lingered, unable to move on, exhausted and on the verge of collapse. I finally found myself back in my room. The door creaked open, and the piano music resumed, louder and more intense than before. The shadowy figure from earlier stood in the center of the room, now accompanied by several other apparitions. Their eyes were empty voids, and their presence was suffocating, summoning every ounce of courage. I faced them, demanding they let me go. For a moment, everything was still. Then, one by one, the spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into mist. The room's temperature normalized, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, as if the hotel's spirits had granted me their release. As dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight pierced through the windows, melting the frost and dispelling the shadows. I packed my belongings, my hands trembling but determined to leave. Walking out of the Stanley Hotel, I glanced back one last time. The grand facade stood serene and silent, the horrors of the night seemingly erased by the morning light. Back in my car, I drove away from the hotel, the memories of that night etched deeply into my mind. The Stanley Hotel had shown me its true nature, a place where the past and present coexist, where restless spirits linger in search of peace. I knew I had a story to tell, one that would capture the haunting beauty and terrifying secrets of the Stanley Hotel. Weeks later, as I penned down my experiences, I realized that some places hold mysteries that are best left untouched. The Stanley Hotel had changed me, igniting a passion for uncovering the unknown while reminding me of the thin veil between our world and the supernatural. To this day, when winter arrives and the snow begins to fall, I can't help but feel a lingering connection to that haunted sanctuary in Colorado, forever etched in my soul.